Hello, lovely future ancient historians who are coming into year 12. Welcome to your next bridging class lesson. Sorry it's a little late. I'm not great with technology. If you've met me, you know this. So what we'll be looking at today is hoplite warfare and a key aspect of Greek relations in the 5th century. So if you're using a book or keeping notes, which ideally you should do, just take a minute, write down the title and the aim, and then we've got a bit of a thinking point to start with. As always, there is an ancient history version of everything, and what happened in the past also happens now. So if you can have a look at the image in front of you, the question we've got is, what ways can or do countries and states resolve their differences? A lot of what we'll look at in the Greek side of the course will be very reminiscent of what's happening now in the wider world. So it doesn't have to be based on Greece. Think about the modern world, the near history of the world. What examples can you think of how states and countries have resolved their differences? And just pause this video while you are doing that. So, long story short, the ultimate way in which modern states, to some extent, and particularly in the Greek world, the way states solved really embedded, entrenched differences would be through conflict. This was very typical in the ancient world, especially in Greece, where you have a series of rival city-states and a small landmass all wanting dominance over each other. So as a result, it was not uncommon that each city-state would be prepared for this. So each state would have some form of standing army, so a full-time army. These were very often quite small. They may represent a city guard, or in some cases a navy, or sometimes more specialised groups like the Sacred Band of Thebans, who were a kind of almost monastic group of soldiers. Typically as well, because this army was nowhere near big enough to fight another state, Greek city-states would also have what was called a citizen militia. This was the expectation that every adult male would be expected to fight if needed. And very often in the case of Greece in the 5th century, they were needed, as nicely summed up by this silly little meme at the bottom. The accurate summary of the Peloponnesian Wars: the Greeks fighting the Greeks. There are some exceptions to this rule, particularly the Spartans, and we'll look at those a little later, but this is the general makeup of the Greeks preparing to fight each other. So we'll start by looking, or revisiting in some cases, at the kind of basic building block of Greek warfare in this period. And the standard method of fighting between Greek states was called hoplite warfare. And that's named after these guys. Hoplites are heavily armoured infantry. This method of fighting suited Greece particularly well. They had a lot of skilled metal workers needed to create the weapons, and particularly the heavy bronze armour. It also had an awful lot of tough terrain. It's very mountainous. There are natural valleys and natural choke points where these type of soldiers could act as effectively a human barricade and block the advance of any other state. There are lots of other types of light infantry, like things like Presidians, Sciritae, slingers and so on, but hoplites are the most respected. They are the backbone. Hoplites were usually from the kind of middle classes and upwards, because in most cases they had to pay for their own armour, they had to provide their own weaponry, and these became kind of symbols of status and honour within Greece. They were sort of akin to the kind of Japanese samurai class. The hoplite class were well respected, and certainly if you were born into one of these wealthier families, you would be expected to take up the role of a hoplite on a battlefield to protect your city-state. So it was seen as quite an honourable thing. So on to our first task, getting familiar with what a hoplite was. So on the screen in front of you, you've got a little diagram, an illustration of a Greek hoplite decked out in all his gear. Around it you've got the various labels for what he's carrying or what he's wearing. So the task I want you to do first, and this is what I want you to submit back into Google Classroom, on the document attached to this lesson which talks about hoplites, there's a table I want you to complete. So for each of these examples, can you give me a brief description of it, think about what the advantages of this could be, and also then think about some of the disadvantages. So this is largely an exercise in familiarising yourself with the key concepts, the key terms, but also some lateral thinking. Some of it is very straightforward as well. So if you think about, if we start with the shield, the Hoplon shield, which is where the hoplite gets its name from, brief description, it's a large round shield, painted, it's made of bronze and leather. The advantages are it stops you getting stabbed. The disadvantages are obviously it's big, it's quite heavy, and it can be quite difficult to manoeuvre. So pause this video while you do that task. You don't have to do full sentences, developed bullet points are fine, and again, this is one thing I want you to resubmit back onto Google Classroom. So pause this video now and do that task. So as we said, one of the key features of a hoplite was this big round Hoplon shield, and arguably this was the most important part of a hoplite's equipment. It protected not only you, but also the man next to you. If you look on the bottom, you'll see this idea of a shield wall made of Hoplon shields. So this is why it was so important. If you dropped your spear, that was fine, that was your problem. But if you dropped your shield, you'd not only put yourself at risk, but the man next to you. Now, these Hoplon shields are often highly decorated with symbols that are either important to you as an individual, because you had to provide your own equipment, or something you tied your ideas to. So typically, if you were an Athenian hoplite, you might decide to have an owl painted on your shield, because the owl was the symbol of Athens. It could be a part of a story, part of your favourite story, some mythological thing, whatever you thought was going to bring you luck in battle. If you look in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see this big garish face painted on that Hoplon shield. This is a Medusa head. Now this seems to be a really common thing to be put on Hoplon shields. There's lots of examples of this, and the idea would be to terrify the opposing army. It's similar to how particularly aircraft pilots paint shark faces on aircraft and so on. It's that idea of making you feel a bit more confident, trying to terrify the enemy. So these Hoplon shields were usually very personalised, and also meant it was easy to identify your friends on the battlefield. We should point out, however, this is not the case for the Spartans. So, as we said previously, this was not necessarily the case for the Spartans. One thing you'll find out throughout this course is that if there's a normal way of doing it, Sparta will do something different. They are the oddballs of the Greek world. So unlike other Greek states who would maintain a small army and a citizen militia, the Spartans didn't. They maintained a full-time professional army. It's pretty much the case that all adult male Spartans had to be soldiers. That was the only thing they were allowed to do. If you wanted to be a poet or a potter or a blacksmith, Sparta was not the place for you. You were born to be a hoplite. Because they put such emphasis on this, Spartan hoplites equipment was provided by the state. They didn't have to buy it themselves. In fact, the Spartans basically did away with money, so everything was provided by the state. And to this end, all Spartan shields, for as much as we can gather, bore a lambda to symbol Laconia. Lambda is the Greek letter for L. It's that funny triangle shape you can see on this shield. Laconia is the region that Sparta is in. Other Greek states wouldn't call the Spartans necessarily Spartans. They'd refer to them usually as Lacedaemonians, so the lambda was their uniform symbol. And there is a great emphasis on uniformity and collectivism and equality in Sparta in terms of military thinking. They didn't want anyone too tall, too short, too fat, too thin. A shield wall worked best when everyone was about the same. and if you've got this uniform wall of shields with the same image on, it added to that kind of uniformity and collectivism. So when it comes to hoplites actually fighting, it was very, very rare for hoplites to fight individually. If you have seen it, any of the 300 movies where they have a tendency to spin around and twirl the spears and leap into the air and do all kinds of fancy things, this could not actually be further from the nature of hoplite warfare. Hoplites moved in a phalanx, and they'd spend a lot of time practicing and perfecting this formation. The phalanx effectively is a large body of men protected by a shield wall, and from that shield wall obviously protruded various spears. This was not a fast moving formation by any means, because obviously the men are wearing just short of their own body weight in armour, and they've got to be tightly packed and in formation. But they would practice moving in unison, and a good hoplite phalanx could move quite quickly and effectively onto a battlefield and towards the enemy. When it came to fighting in a phalanx formation, it was not dissimilar to a heavily armoured rugby match, a rugby scrum. The two sides would smash into each other, crash into each other, and try and overpower each other, either by pushing or stabbing. It wasn't particularly pleasant. There wasn't any great skill in it apart from being able to survive. Again, if you were facing the phalanx, you'd be facing this shield wall with multiple spears. And if you think about the armour of the hoplites, there'd be very little of them exposed. This is one key thing with the hoplites. They are heavily armoured. You can struggle on a battlefield to find anywhere to effectively try and stab them. Because of the nature of the shields, and everyone was trained right-handed, the phalanx was weakest on the right. So skilled commanders would try and manoeuvre phalanxes or their armies to outmanoeuvre on the right-hand side, because they knew this was a bit of a weak spot. Typically though, once people realised this and started doing it, other armies, and Greek armies as well, would do what they could to try and protect the right hand side. So you'd have your best men on the right, or maybe even a separate group of shield bearers to protect them. So the whole thing moves in unison, and largely the instructions are dictated by, if you look on the image at the top, this little flute player at the back. The flute player wasn't there just to play a nice tune as you're going into battle. The instructions on a battlefield were often signalled through either flags or musical signals. The idea of a flute, because it's quite high pitched, it would be more audible on a battlefield where there's lots of people screaming and crying and yelling. The pitch of the flute would sail above all of that and would ultimately be more audible. And this next slides just for fun. Obviously I've uploaded the PowerPoint as well, so you can click the link directly from here. Here are two cheesy videos. The first one is from the History Channel and is terribly dramatic, but gives you a broad understanding of what hoplite warfare was, what a phalanx was, and how it worked. The second video is even worse. It's from a disastrously bad American TV show called The Deadliest Warrior, where you get some basically scary war dads, or people who are a bit too enthusiastic about swords, to recreate these kind of historic military figures, and then they do ridiculous things like pitch them against each other. So this episode is looking at who would win between a Spartan hoplite and a ninja. It's complete fallacy, it's complete nonsense. The idea that the two would ever meet is not only historically ridiculous, but also the nature in how they would meet would also be completely ridiculous. Like we said, you wouldn't really find a single hoplite on a battlefield. He'd make sure he turned up with all his mates. So just have a quick watch of these. I take no responsibility for the quality or ridiculousness of these productions, but you know, it's always good to watch and have a laugh at someone trying to be overly dramatic about things. So, talking of overly dramatic, or very dramatic, arguably one of the most well-known instances of hoplites fighting is at the Battle of Thermopylae, in Herodotus' account of the Persian Wars. The Battle of Thermopylae was fought in 480 BC, where the Spartans and other Greeks fought off the Persian army. This is not necessarily the best example of hoplite warfare, but certainly it's one of the more interesting to read. So this leads us to our second task, based on the Battle of Thermopylae and the hoplites. So like we said, this is one of the most dramatic descriptions of hoplite warfare, and there is certainly some historical embellishment going on Herodotus' part. Like I said, the battle is where a small force of Greek hoplites held off the entirety of Xerxes' Persian army for a few days, and even though in the end they all died because of treachery, it's a good example of the advantages of this heavily armoured phalanx in a narrow choke point. And I've attached some to the lesson some highlights from Herodotus' account of the Battle of Thermopylae on your Herodotus sheet. So the task is dead straightforward. All I want you to do, read the various passages and underline anything that tells us about how the Greeks fought. So how can we use Herodotus as evidence of how the Greeks fought? What you should do then, now the suggestion here is circle and wiggly underline. You may want to colour code it if you're doing it digitally. The next thing I want you to look for is anything in the source that illustrates how brave the Spartans were. Don't forget, the Spartans have this reputation for being the most fearsome warriors, the bravest men in all of Greece. So either circle or highlight, make sure you include a key, any extracts in this from these sources that suggest the Spartans were brave. Similarly, as either a wiggly underline or in a different colour, try and highlight anything that shows the Persians being cowards, or being certainly not as brave or fearsome or dedicated, or let's just face it, psychotic as the Spartans. Again, this is another thing I'd like you to return as your work back onto the Google Classroom. Similarly, now if you're feeling brave and you think, oh, that's not too much to do, I can do much more than that, and if you already have a copy of Herodotus, or if you can find a decent online version, try doing the same activity but with the full account of the battle. So in Herodotus it's book 7, 208 onwards. It's quite a lengthy description, but it's definitely worth the read. You will not be disappointed. It's written very dramatically, very lyrically, and there will be lots of examples you can find. So again, I want you to find, if you want to do this task, this is the extension, do the same thing. Can you find something in the account that tells us how the Greeks fought, so good examples of hoplite warfare in action? Can you find examples of the Spartans being brave? And you will find lots and completely ridiculous ones in some instances, and also examples of the Persians being cowardly, weak, or not up to the task. So if you want to do this task, you don't have to do the previous one, but pause the video while you're doing either of these Herodotus tasks. And so last but not least, we need to draw everything to a close. Now you don't have to submit this, I would do this for your own benefit, something nice and quick and easy to refer back to. So looking at hoplites, the armour, the style of fighting, the idea of the phalanx, what happened at Thermopylae, just come up with a couple of strengths and weaknesses of hoplite warfare, because this will become important. At some point throughout the course there are instances where city-states struggle to break any kind of military deadlock. So just do a quick summary of what are the strengths and weaknesses of hoplites, hoplite warfare and the phalanx. And until next time, I'll see you later.